Hello, good evening, everyone. My name is Sarah Palermo, Senior Manager of Annual Leadership Giving at the Missouri Botanical Garden. Thank you for joining us for tonight's Spotlight Series presentation. Babs Wagner, horticulturist of Indoor Nurseries, will lead us on a tour of the greenhouses and tell us all about our orchid collection. Babs has been with the Missouri Botanical Garden for over 25 years and specializes in orchid care. While overseeing the orchid collection, she has added hundreds of new species that are of conservation concern to our living collection. One of the things she enjoys most about her job is growing the vanilla species, and the garden has one of the most diverse collections in the United States. In addition to taking care of the collection at home, Babs enjoys networking with orchid growers around the world. She has traveled to 2 World Orchid Conferences, one in Vancouver, Canada, and one in Johannesburg, South Africa, as well as the European Orchid Conference in London, England. During her travels, she has had the opportunity to see orchids in situ, or in the wild, while in South Africa and Costa Rica. With her wealth of knowledge, we are so lucky to have Babs on the garden staff and here with us this evening to take us on a tour of the orchid collection. If you have any questions during the presentation, please submit them using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. We will try and answer all your questions, but if we run out of time, a member of our team will follow up with a response via email. Now we will hear from Garden President, Dr. Peter Wise-Jackson, and begin the tour.
Good evening, and thank you for joining us for tonight's Spotlight Series program. My name is Peter Wise-Jackson, and I'm president of the Missouri Botanical Garden. The Spotlight Series is offered exclusively for you, the members of the garden's giving societies. We are so grateful to be able to share these virtual events with you all as some of our most generous and valued friends and supporters. Virtual connections like these provide a good way for us to bring you new information and updates on the garden's mission work, its landscapes, events, and achievements in science, conservation, horticulture, education, and sustainability. In these programs, we take a closer look at the garden. We can show you the impact of your generosity and support and the advancements that you help to make possible. And we can also take you into places in the garden that you might otherwise not have the opportunity to explore or experience. Thank you all for your support, which we appreciate so much. I hope you enjoyed the program.
Hi, I'm Babs Wagner, and I'm the orchid grower here at the garden, and I've been here now for over 25 years, taking care of this incredible collection. Our collection is actually grown in 3 different greenhouses, 3 climate-controlled greenhouses, cool, intermediate, and warm, and we have orchids from all over the world in these greenhouses. Historically, the collection dates all the way back to the 1800s, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. But in the meantime, I just want to show you some bits and pieces, some of the highlights of our collection that are blooming, and maybe some that aren't even in bloom yet. What you see on this bench behind me are orchids from the genus Angraecum. And the Angraecum are a really specialized group of orchids from Madagascar. This orchid right next to me is commonly referred to as Darwin's orchid. And the reason it's called Darwin's orchid is because Darwin actually describes the pollinator for this species, which is Angraecum sesquipedale. He describes it in his book, Origin of Species, and he talks about a moth that had to have had a really long proboscis in order to pollinate the flower. That moth hadn't been discovered when he described the orchid, and shortly after his description, lo and behold, the moth was discovered. So ever since then, it's always been known as Darwin's orchid. These are all pollinated by moths. They're fragrant at night. It's really a delight to come in here early on a morning and smell the angraecums in bloom. These that you see here now, most of them have been in bloom now since early November. So they last a really long time. And they all have a characteristic spur. And the moth has to get its proboscis down to the bottom of that spur in order to pollinate the flower. I'm standing in front of Vanilla planifolia. A lot of people don't realize that vanilla comes from an orchid. The garden is proud to have about 16 different species of vanilla. And they usually bloom for us in summer and winter. And in the wild, they are vines, and they will vine 70, 80 feet up into a tree canopy, and it's when they go back down, when gravity takes them down, that is when they start to flower. The flowers only last one day, but you'll have sequential blooming, so the bloom period will go on for a while. They all have to be pollinated by hand because the bee that pollinates them is not native to where they grow naturally. And the whole process of pollinating, the ripening pods, harvesting, curing is really lengthy, and so that gives you an idea of why vanilla is so expensive. Behind me is Chromatophyllum speciosum. This orchid is one of the largest orchids in the world. They can grow up to the size of a ton, a small elephant, if you will. The one behind me, you can see how large it is. This was acquired by the garden in 1989, and I have yet to see it flower. Apparently they have to get really, really big in order to flower. Orchids are either epiphytic or they're terrestrial. Epiphytic orchids grow in trees or on branches or on tree trunks. Terrestrial orchids grow in the ground. What we have here are some epiphytic orchids that don't grow well in pots, and so we mount them on pieces of cork. Cork is a renewable resource. The cork tree will regrow its bark, its cork bark, in 7 years, and they can strip the tree from it with its bark for 7 times, and then they have to stop, and then it becomes detrimental to the tree. But the reason we like to use it to mount orchids is because the epiphytic roots love to cling to the cork because of the nooks and crannies. And so that is why we mount orchids on cork. This particular orchid, Brassavola nodosa, has a wonderful nickname of Lady of the Night, and that's because it's phototropic, meaning that it is only fragrant when it's dark. So if you have this orchid growing in your home and you have it in a dark room, you can walk into that room and it will be just incredibly fragrant. But the minute you turn the light on, that fragrance will dissipate. Hence the Lady of the Night. We are now in what we call the intermediate house of the orchid collection. This is our largest greenhouse, and we came out of the warm house, so we're kind of going down in temperature. So most of the orchids in this house are native to Central and South America. In 1876, Mrs. Henry Blow gave the founder of the garden, Henry Shaw, his very first orchids. And he liked them so much that that was the beginning of the whole orchid collection. Then in the early 1920s, George Pring was sent to Colombia, and he came back with over 5,000 cattleyas. So that was what kick-started the entire orchid collection. And in 1924, they had their very first orchid show. So cattleyas, as you can see from these large white flowers, are very showy. And so they are probably the predominant orchid of our display of orchids throughout the garden. when we do display orchids. Right now the orchids are displayed in the climatron, and we change them out every week. And they also have some divisions of our species tied into the trees and on branches and tree trunks in the climatron, which can give you an idea of how they would grow naturally in the wild. Generally, cattleyas are very fragrant, but they're not all fragrant at the same time. It all depends on the genetic makeup of the plant. This is Ansellia africa, native to Africa. It's considered an endangered orchid in the wild. Here at the garden, we've been doing a lot of conservation with orchids and trying to target orchids that are rare or endangered in the wild. So when we acquire an endangered orchid, of course by legal means, not by collecting, all of our orchids are given a zinc, which is what I'm holding in my hand here. And the black zincs, which are metal tags, indicate that the plant is rare and endangered. We have an extensive record-keeping system here at the garden, and all our plants throughout the garden are entered in our living collections management system database. Here in the orchid collection and in other areas of the garden, we put barcodes on our zincs, and if you zoom in and you have a barcode reader, it'll give you all the information you need to know about that particular orchid. When it was acquired, how long we've had the plant, how many we have, and it's a valuable tool, particularly for me when I go to repot or divide an orchid. What I'm holding here is a catasetum hybrid. Catasetum is a genus that grows in Central and South America, and in its native habitat, it goes dormant. So when we're trying to grow it in cultivation, we have to simulate that dormancy. So starting in about late October, early November, I gradually decrease watering until I stop altogether. And the plant, which used to have many strapping leaves on it, gradually drops all its leaves, and sometimes it blooms after the leaves have dropped. This plant is interesting in that in order to be pollinated, the insect has to climb inside the flower, and it hits the pollen, and the pollen winds up being jetted out of the flower, and then the plant is pollinated. We've now moved into the cool orchid house. This greenhouse houses orchids primarily from Australia, New Zealand, cloud forest orchids, orchids growing at higher elevations. What you see here around me are Paphiopedilum or lady slipper orchids. These are faithful bloomers. They bloom once a year, every year. They've been in the collection since 1918. Back in 1915 and 1918, D.S. Brown, who lived in Kirkwood, donated his entire collection of orchids, which his collection was famous and known around the world. And he donated his collection, many of which were these Paphiopedilums that you see here. Most people are used to seeing orchids growing in pots or, as I showed you earlier, mounted on pieces of cork. But another way to display orchids is to tie them onto branches of Osage orange, which is what you see here. This particular branch was just done 2 years ago. And it gives you an idea of how orchids would grow naturally in the wild. Osage orange is a really, really hard wood, especially after it's dried and cured. And when we mount orchids on it, we can usually leave those orchids on there for probably anywhere from 6 to 8 years before the wood will start to rot. It also has wonderful little fissures in the bark that the roots like to crawl into and attach to. So when we initially put the orchids on there, we tie them on with fishing line. So you really can't see the attachment at all, and eventually the orchid will grow over it. This particular plant, this branch has about 20 individual plants tied onto it. And eventually, probably within the next 2 years, they will all just grow together and it'll look like it's one continuous plant. This is something most people don't get to see unless they're actually here like you are with me in the orchid range. This goofy looking tape is marking some seed pods. This is a Calanthe terrestrial orchid that we decided we would like to have more of it, and so our micro-propagator, Caleb, pollinated it for me, self-pollinated it when it was in bloom, and now we're waiting for the seeds to ripen. We're really excited to be starting up a new laboratory so that we can once again do micro-propagation, tissue culture, and various other means of propagation like we used to do many, many years ago here at the garden with the orchid collection and other collections throughout. So hopefully we will have more. We're trying to increase especially our terrestrial orchids and get more diversity into the collection that way. So that's kind of where we're starting with the micro propagation. But it'll be very exciting when we start beginning orchids from seed. We're going to have to be patient. It can take many, many years for an orchid to bloom from seed to blooming time. Those of you that grow orchids at home that have questions, you can always access the Kemper Center for Home Gardening. They have culture sheets. They're very knowledgeable about how to care for common orchids. And I also want to thank you all for coming with me today on this fun tour. It was fun for me to show you some of the fun, different things we have growing in our orchid collection.
Thank you, Babs, for that wonderful tour, and thank you for sharing with everyone the orchid range. We do have some questions that have come in, so please feel free to ask more questions while the Q&A is going on. Just use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. And we have a couple of questions to start. One of them actually has to deal directly with how to grow orchids in your home. Phyllis has asked a great question that she has a very dry apartment, and she's wondering how often she should water her small orchid, and what's the best judge of when the orchid needs water?
Well, Phyllis, it's probably, if you have a very dry apartment, the first thing you need to do is probably increase your humidity, which you can do by placing your orchid on a little saucer filled with like pea gravel, and then adding water to that saucer, and that will increase the humidity right around the orchid. It's hard. Sometimes it depends a lot on whether the orchid is in a plastic pot or a clay pot. But a lot of times if you just pick the plant up, you'll be able to tell by the weight of it, whether it's wet or dry. Another thing you can do is you can take a pencil and stick it down into the mix by about 1 inch. And then if you pull that pencil out and the end is wet, you'll know that it's still wet and you won't necessarily want to water it. But usually in the winter, your orchids are going to need a little bit more water if they're in a drier environment than if you are growing them in the summer and maybe you place them on a porch or outside.
Thank you. We have another question about some home orchid care, and it is in regards to the roots. And should the individual be cutting the roots regularly, or what's the best care for, I believe it would probably be a potted orchid?
Most people are growing Phalaenopsis at home, and Phalaenopsis tend to have these roots, these sort of gangly roots that are almost like aerial roots. They want to not be in the pot. They want to just kind of cruise all over the place. And you really don't want to cut those roots off. And you don't necessarily have to get them back in the pot if you decide to repot the plant. You can just leave them be. They actually are pulling moisture out of the atmosphere around them, and that's kind of, in nature, those are like adventitious roots, and they tend to just kind of reach out and grab onto a tree or a branch, mainly for support. So it's okay for those roots to be there, and you really don't want to cut them off unless they're completely shriveled up and dry and dead.
We have another really good question in regards to pollinating orchids. And I think this person was asking how you hand pollinate all the orchids or just the ones that you are looking to propagate for the seed collection.
Well, we certainly don't pollinate all the orchids. There's over 6,000 of them in the collection, so that would be quite the job. Right now, we are concentrating on our rare or historic orchids, and those are the ones that we really have an interest in preserving because of the historical value and also if they're endangered in the wild. So we're primarily focusing on those. But really, if I have an orchid that I think is really special or, you know, a beautiful hybrid of some type that I would like more of, then I can ask Caleb to pollinate it for me.
That's great. So how many, just as a follow-up, I'm curious, how many, you said that there was the one that you pollinated for seed that we were looking at in the video. Did you do more than just one during that I guess, trial?
We've been actually pollinating orchids now for a couple of years in the collection. Sometimes the pods ripen sooner than at other times, but we've had some pods on the plants for like as close to a year before they're actually ripe. And so Caleb is on our staff. He is our micro propagator, and so he'll come in periodically and wander through the collection, and, you know, we'll target specific orchids that we want to pollinate.
That's great. We have a question from Anne. She is looking to get some answers about telling about the root from a flower-bearing stem, and what's the best way to determine the difference between those two features on the orchid plant?
A lot of people get confused if they're looking at, say, a bud coming up from a leaf axil from between two leaves, or another like stem of the plant. And you really just have to wait and see what it does. I mean, as it grows, it'll be pretty clear to you whether it's a bud or a leaf or even another root. So they definitely have a different look to them depending on what they are.
And then another question about when should you repot your orchid?
You need to repot your orchid if the mix is breaking down or it's outgrowing its pot. And really the best time for a lot of orchids is when they're making new growth, which is usually spring and summer. Those are really the best times to do it. If you have Paphiopedilums, which are lady slipper orchids, or you have Phalaenopsis, you can really repot those any time of the year. But unless your mix is breaking down or it's climbing out of its pot, if it's happy, you don't really want to disturb it.
A happy orchid is a wonderful thing to have. So this is definitely a question that we've been fielding in our office that we want to be able to answer and get some clarification about, but it is about the orchid show, where our annual orchid show is not happening this year. Can you just give us a little background and info about some of the reasons behind us not doing it this year with COVID, and also the new building of the Jack C. Taylor Visitor Center.
Well, part of the problem is that with the construction of the new visitor center, we've lost our Orthwine floral display hall. And so we don't have that large space right now to display 400 to 500 orchids. However, that being said, going forward, we're going to have a brand new conservatory, which is going to be constructed practically right outside the existing greenhouses where the orchid range is now. And it will be a permanently planted conservatory with plants primarily from the Mediterranean. And that conservatory, those plants will be the backdrop for all our shows going forward. So the next orchid show will be in 2023, which sounds like a long way off, but it's only 2 years. And in the meantime, there are always blooming orchids in the climatron that you can see. As I said earlier in the video, we have a rotating display of orchids in the climatron. So every week there are new blooming orchids that come out of the collection and go into the climatron.
Thank you. And the climatron is the best place to be in the middle of winter anyway. So I encourage everyone to come and go in the climatron and find their favorite orchid in there. So I have a couple of other questions that have come in about, do you see that question on there, Babs? Some orchids rebloom from the same leaves, or do they come from new leaves?
I don't see the question, but I guess they really don't bloom on the same leaf. The only orchid I can really think of that will rebloom off of old growth are cane-type dendrobiums. And those, even though the old canes lose their leaves, they're still capable of producing blooms on those canes. And so with an orchid like that, you don't want to remove any of the canes if they're still green, only if they turn brown and they're completely dead. Then you can cut them off. But other orchids usually will produce new blooms from newer growth. So cattleyas, if they produce new pseudobulbs, that's where your flowers will come from. And a Phalaenopsis generally will produce them. You know, they grow straight up, so they're going to produce blooms, you know, from between leaf axils or sometimes even at the base of the plant.
And this is definitely another question that we get, and one of the topics that you've covered in previous talks and during previous orchid shows that we've had about home care for your orchid. And you really laid it out a year ago when you dove deep into how to fertilize and the best fertilizer, because that is what you said is it gets the orchid to bloom. And so Jan has asked the question that a lot of people do is they bought a beautiful Phalaenopsis or it was given to them and it never blooms again. So what do they do?
Well, the first thing you need to do when you get a new orchid is put some kind of a date on it. Most of us, if we're going to buy an orchid, we're going to buy it in bloom because, you know, it's beautiful. We want to enjoy the flowers. And then as time goes on, the blooms are spent and you cut off the flower spike. But most of the orchids that are available for purchase only bloom once a year. And so sometimes it's really, you don't remember when you bought it. So by putting a date on it, you'll sort of have a reference for when you should expect it to bloom again. A lot of people don't realize that orchids need to be fed just like regular tropical plants do. And so generally you need to feed them during their growing time when they're making new growth, usually a couple times a month. And I always say just take whatever the directions are on the fertilizer and cut it in half. So dilute it down to half strength. Because if you use full strength fertilizer, you're probably going to burn the roots on the plant. So they need fertilizer, and if you can't get them to bloom, with a Phalaenopsis, you can put it outside in the fall and subject it to a week of like cooler temperatures, probably in like the lower 50s. And if that doesn't work, you can try feeding with a blossom booster fertilizer. And fertilizers usually have 3 numbers. So the first number is your nitrogen, which is like your leafy growth. And the middle number is what helps the plant bloom. It's phosphorus. And then the third number on there is potash, which is your roots. And so if you use a fertilizer that's higher in the middle number, that's adding additional phosphorus to the plant. And sometimes that'll encourage it to flower.
What is your preferred fertilizer? Do you have a brand, or, I mean, the garden I'm sure gets its own, but what would be available for the general market?
You don't need to use a fertilizer that's specifically for orchids. Miracle Grow is a good fertilizer. Peters, Schultz, if they even make, I think they still make Schultz. But really any kind of all-purpose fertilizer is a good fertilizer for just general feeding. And you can use the same fertilizer you use on your other house plants. And so most of the year you're going to be using an all-purpose fertilizer, which is something where all the numbers are even, or maybe it's 20, 10, 20. And that's a good just general use fertilizer. But really, you don't need a specific specialized fertilizer for your orchids.
Well, thank you so much for all your answers and taking us on this wonderful tour. And this has definitely been a highlight for this month. Always looking forward to the orchids and things in bloom. And I just really want to thank you so much for being here and talking to everyone tonight. Of course, Babs said this during the presentation, but if you do have any questions that weren't answered or anything else, you can always contact us through the plant doctor and the Q&A down here on our screen. We've been able to answer almost everyone's questions, but we can always answer more if you reach out to us directly. And the last thing I wanted to just bring up for everyone is our next Spotlight series, which will be coming up on February 17th. And this will be focusing on the herbarium, which is a different part of the garden's collection. And this is actually one of the world's largest collections of dried plants. So we hope that you will sign up for that. And thank you so much for being here tonight. And thank you for all of our donors. What we do here at the garden wouldn't be possible without your support. So thank you so much. And thanks again, Babs, and have a wonderful evening.
Thank you.